Picture this. A misty dawn. The year is 793 AD, and a quiet English monastery sits peacefully by the sea. Monks pray, unaware of the dragon-headed ships slicing through the waves. In moments, chaos erupts. Fierce warriors with braided beards and gleaming axes storm the shore, leaving history forever changed. This was the first Viking raid on Lindisfarne, a moment that shocked Europe and birthed a legend. Who were these ruthless warriors? Why did they strike with such ferocity? And what drove them to sail across treacherous seas to plunder and conquer? Stay with me, because we're about to unravel the secrets of medieval Viking raids, from their daring tactics to the surprising truths behind their legacy. You'll discover 3 incredible insights that will change how you see these warriors forever. Let's dive into the saga. Imagine standing on the shores of Scandinavia 1,000 years ago. The wind howls, the fjords gleam under a pale sun, and you're surrounded by a people forged by a harsh, unforgiving land. The Vikings weren't just raiders, they were farmers, traders, poets, and explorers, driven by a culture that celebrated courage and cunning. To understand their raids, we need to start with their world. Scandinavia in the late 8th century was a patchwork of small communities where survival meant mastering the sea. With rocky soil and long winters, farming alone couldn't sustain everyone. The sea offered fish, trade, and, most importantly, opportunity. But here's the kicker. The Vikings didn't just wake up one day and decide to plunder Europe. Their raids were sparked by a perfect storm of ambition, technology, and timing. Let's talk about their ships, because these were the Ferraris of the medieval world. Viking longships were sleek, lightweight, and terrifyingly fast, with shallow drafts that let them glide up rivers or beach on shores without warning. Picture a ship 80 feet long, carved with intricate dragon heads, powered by oars and a single square sail, carrying 40 warriors ready to strike. These ships weren't just boats, they were weapons of psychological warfare, designed to inspire dread. The Vikings perfected shipbuilding, using overlapping planks and flexible wood to create vessels that could withstand stormy seas. This technology gave them a massive edge. They could hit and run before anyone knew what happened. But why raid? Why not just trade? Well, trading was great, but raiding was faster, bolder, and brought instant wealth. A single successful raid could make a Viking rich, earning him fame and followers in a society that valued glory above all. Now let's zoom in on that first raid at Lindisfarne in 793. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a contemporary record, describes it as a bolt from the blue. Heathen men ravaged and burned. The monks were defenseless, their sacred relics looted, their buildings torched. To Christian Europe, this was sacrilege, a sign of divine wrath. But to the Vikings, it was a jackpot. Monasteries were soft targets, packed with gold, silver, and jeweled relics, guarded by men who didn't fight back. The raid's success sent shockwaves through Scandinavia. Word spread. Across the sea, riches waited for the bold. This wasn't random violence. It was a calculated strike, the opening act of a century of raids that would reshape Europe. But let's pause and ask, were the Vikings just bloodthirsty pirates? That's the image Hollywood loves. Horned helmets, swinging axes, total chaos. Spoiler, they didn't wear horned helmets. That's a 19th century myth. And while they were fierce, their raids were strategic, not mindless. I've always found it fascinating how the Vikings balanced brutality with brilliance. They studied their targets, learned local languages, and even used spies to scout defenses. Take the raid on Paris in 845. A Viking leader named Ragnar, possibly the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, led 120 ships up the Seine River, catching the Franks off guard. The city's walls were strong, but Ragnar's men were patient. They blockaded, probed weaknesses, and eventually forced King Charles the Bald to pay 7,000 pounds of silver to leave. That's over 2 million in today's money. This wasn't chaos. It was a masterclass in extortion. Let's dig deeper into their tactics, because this is where the Vikings shine. They were the special forces of their day, relying on speed, surprise, and psychological terror. Raids often hit at dawn or under cover of fog, with longships appearing, like ghosts. Warriors would leap ashore, overwhelm defenses, grab loot, and vanish before reinforcements arrived. They favored hit and run over pitched battles, knowing their small numbers couldn't match Europe's armies. But when they did fight, they were ferocious. The Viking shield wall, a tight formation of interlocking shields, was nearly unbreakable, and their axes, often wielded two-handed, could cleave through armor. I read once that a single Viking axe blow could split a man's helmet and skull in one swing. That's not just strength, that's a weapon designed for maximum impact. What's wild is how the Vikings adapted to their targets. Early raids hit monasteries, but as Europe fortified its churches, the Vikings pivoted to towns, markets, and even other Viking settlements. They weren't picky. They raided as far east as the Caspian Sea and as far west as Newfoundland. Yes, Newfoundland. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson and his crew landed in North America, 500 years before Columbus. They didn't stay long, but sites like Lanceau Meadows in Canada prove they were there. This blows my mind. While Europe was still reeling from Viking raids, these guys were crossing the Atlantic in open boats. That's not just courage, that's next-level ambition. But ambition alone doesn't explain the raids. Let's talk about their culture, because this is where we find the heart of the Viking spirit. Norse society was built on reputation. A man's worth was measured by his deeds, his saga, or story. Raiding wasn't just about wealth, it was about earning a name that would live forever. Young warriors, often second or third sons with no land to inherit, saw raiding as a path to glory. If you came back with gold, slaves, or tales of victory, you were a hero. If you died bravely, you'd feast in Valhalla with Odin. This belief in an afterlife of endless battles fueled their fearlessness. I've always thought this mindset is what made them so unstoppable. Death wasn't failure, it was just another chapter. Let's shift gears and look at the impact of these raids, because they didn't just loot and leave. The Vikings changed Europe forever. Their attacks forced kings to build stronger defenses, like fortified bridges and coastal watchtowers. England. The raids led to the unification of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms under leaders like Alfred the Great, who fought back and laid the groundwork for a unified England. In France, the Vikings settled in Normandy, becoming the Normans who later conquered England in 1066. It's crazy to think that without Viking raids, the Battle of Hastings might never have happened. Even trade routes shifted, as Viking merchants linked Europe with the Middle East, bringing silk, spices, and silver into the mix. But it wasn't all destruction. The Vikings were also settlers. In places like Iceland, Greenland, and parts of Scotland, they built thriving communities. They brought their laws, their language, and their stories, leaving a legacy that's still alive today. If you've ever visited Dublin, you're walking on a city founded by Vikings. Their runestones, huge carved rocks, still dot Scandinavia, telling tales of raids and voyages. I saw one in Sweden a few years back, covered in swirling runes, and it hit me. These weren't just warriors, they were storytellers, obsessed with being remembered. Now let's get personal for a moment. When I first learned about the Vikings, I thought they were just barbarians. But the more I dug, the more I saw their complexity. They weren't saints. Raiding meant bloodshed, enslavement, and terror. But they were also innovators, driven by a hunger for more wealth, more land, more fame. As an American, I can't help but see a bit of that restless spirit in the pioneers who crossed oceans for a new life. The Vikings were medieval. Pioneers betting everything on their ships and their courage. That's what makes their story so gripping. They were human, flawed, and fearless. Let's explore one raid in detail to bring this to life. The attack on Noirmoutier, a French island monastery, in 799. Picture a small community of monks living simply, their island a treasure trove of relics and wine. The Vikings, likely from Denmark, had been scouting the Frankish coast for years. They struck at low tide, their ships skimming over sandbanks no other boat could navigate. The monks fled or were captured, the monastery's wealth loaded onto longships. What's chilling is how precise this was. The Vikings knew the tides, the island's layout, and the monks' routines. This wasn't luck. It was planning. The raid's success emboldened more attacks, turning the Frankish coast into a Viking playground. But here's where it gets messy. Not every raid was a win. The Vikings faced setbacks, especially as Europe fought back. In 860, a Viking fleet tried to sack Constantinople, the glittering capital of the Byzantine Empire. They failed spectacularly. The city's walls and Greek fire, a kind of medieval napalm, were too much. This shows the Vikings weren't invincible. They took risks and sometimes paid the price. I find this humbling. Even the fiercest warriors had limits, and their failures remind us that history isn't just about triumphs. It's about grit and adaptation. Let's talk about the women in these stories, because Viking women weren't just bystanders. While men raided, women often ran farms, traded goods, and wielded real power. Some even joined raids. The saga of Lagertha, a shield maiden, describes her fighting alongside Ragnar Lothbrok with unmatched skill. Whether Lagertha was real or legendary, archaeological finds, like female graves with weapons, suggest women could be warriors. This challenges the stereotype of Vikings as all-male marauders. For a modern audience, especially in the US where strong female characters resonate, these stories add depth to the Viking saga. As we near the end, let's reflect on why the Viking raids matter today. They weren't just a blip in history, they were a force that reshaped the medieval world. Their raids pushed Europe to innovate, unify, and explore. Their legacy lives. In our language, words like sky, knife, and berserk come from Old Norse. Their myths, like Thor and Odin, inspire movies and comics. And their spirit of adventure still captures our imagination. I think that's why we're drawn to them. They remind us what it means to chase the impossible, even when the odds are brutal. So what can we take away from this? First, the Vikings teach us that strategy beats brute force. Their raids succeeded because they planned, adapted, and struck smart. Second, their story shows how ambition can change the world, for better or worse. And third, their legacy reminds us that history is never simple. The Vikings were raiders, yes, but also builders, explorers, and dreamers. Next time you hear about a Viking raid, don't just picture axes and fire. Picture a people who sailed into the unknown, betting everything on their courage. Before we wrap up, I want to hear from you. Have you ever visited a Viking site like a runestone or a longship replica? Drop a comment and share your story. It's amazing to connect over history like this. And if you loved diving into the Viking world, hit that like button and subscribe for more epic tales. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Speaking of which, stick around for our next video. Why the Dark Ages weren't dark, medieval myths. We're busting some of the biggest misconceptions about the medieval world, and it's going to blow your mind. See you there.